So I told you that often using just JavaScript isn't a great option, and that instead using libraries like React is better, because React offers a simpler mental model and provides an easier way of building complex web applications and web user interfaces. But of course, you don't have to believe me. That's why I prepared two basic web applications, two basic demo websites, which essentially have the same content, some tabs you can click to change the content below these tabs, but I built this application with React and also with just JavaScript so that we can compare these web applications. Now, I built these web applications here with help of Code Sandbox, which is an in-browser cloud-based code editor and development environment, which allows you to, for example, work on React projects without installing any software or tools or anything at all on your local system, and which therefore provides you with an easy way of getting started with React. And therefore, attached to this lecture, you find links to these two demo websites, and you can therefore use your browser to play around with them, explore them, and change the code in any way you want. In case the vanilla JavaScript version shouldn't load correctly and the content below the first tab might be missing, simply click this refresh icon here, and it should reload and display this content. Now, in the vanilla JavaScript version, we got two important files. We got the index.html file, which in the end contains the HTML elements that are responsible for displaying the majority of this page. And we got the index.js file, which is responsible for getting hold of these buttons, for adding click listeners to these buttons, and for then updating the UI as these buttons are clicked and these click listeners are triggered. Now, for this course, I do assume that you do have basic JavaScript knowledge, and therefore I won't explain this JavaScript code in depth here. Instead, you can simply pause the video and go through the code on your own with help of those links that are attached to this lecture. And if you're struggling to understand this code, I strongly recommend that you do pick up some basic JavaScript resource in addition to this course, and that you take a look at the next course section where I give you a JavaScript refresher. In the end, in this code, as mentioned, I'm setting up these click listeners, and we're executing this function here whenever a button is clicked. And then in this function, I'm in the end ensuring that the clicked button receives the active CSS class by clearing that class from all buttons and then adding it to the button that was clicked, which is this event target of that click event. And I'm displaying the content below the button by loading the content from this content array, which is an array that contains more arrays inside of it. And that selected content is then passed to a display content function where I in the end create a string that contains a bunch of li elements as text. I create an unordered list element. I clear the tab content element below the buttons so that then to that list I can add that list content string as inner HTML, and I then append that list that contains that list content to that tab content. And that's how this content ends up on the screen as I switch tabs. That's what I'm doing here in JavaScript. And this, of course, is a fairly trivial app here, as you can tell, but still, nonetheless, it does take quite some code to make this app work this way. And of course, there would be alternative ways of writing this code, but I chose an approach that hopefully is also pretty easy to understand and follow along. Now, if we take a look at the React app, we have the same behavior, but the code is very different. If we take a look at this folder, we also find an index.html file in the public folder, but this index.html file is pretty empty in the end. Its body section only contains one div in the end with an ID of root, but this div has no content, because indeed here in the React app, React is responsible for rendering the entire user interface. And it's this index.js file where the React journey starts, so to say. Now, you will of course learn all about React and how it works and what this index.js file does later in the course. So at the moment, you absolutely will not understand everything here, and that's totally fine because this is just a first demo to show you the difference between React and JavaScript. not to teach you all about React in this one single lecture. Now, nonetheless, you should know that in that index.js file, we in the end select this div with an ID root. So this div here is selected, and React takes over that div and starts controlling the div and its content. It's then the app.js file that contains the important code, so to say. In there, we have a function called app, and in this function, there is something strange, because we got a bunch of HTML code in there, and that is definitely not a default JavaScript feature, because by default, if you start adding HTML code to a JavaScript file, you'll get an error. This, by default, is not supported. Now, it does work in the React project because of how this overall project is set up behind the scenes. And later in the course, you will also learn how to set up such a React project locally on your system. Here in Code Sandbox, it's already set up such that it works. But then once it is set up correctly, it's one of the key features of React that you can blend HTML and JavaScript code. And if you then take a look at this HTML code, you'll see that in here, in this app.js file, we in the end got all the HTML code with this header and these buttons and this unordered list that we before found in this index.html file when working with vanilla JavaScript. Now it's all in that one single JavaScript file, but what you'll also notice is that all these JavaScript instructions that we had in the vanilla version are missing in the React version. Instead, in that app.js file, we just got that HTML code, and then in that HTML code, we got some dynamic elements, some dynamic pieces of code blended into the HTML code. Now again, you'll learn all about writing such React code later, but what this code here in the end does is it defines different states, you could say, of the different HTML elements. For example, that this button here should have an active CSS class added to it if this active content index thing here, to which I'll get back in a second, is equal to 0. So if this condition is met. Otherwise, an empty class, so no CSS class, will be added. And we have similar conditions for the other buttons. Down here, where I'm outputting the actual tab content, I have my unordered list here as HTML in JavaScript. And then there we got more dynamic content, where in the end we're loading such a nested array from that content array, depending on which button was clicked. So depending on this active content index thing here. And then all these items in that nested array, so all these string items here, are in the end converted to list items, something that also doesn't work in vanilla JavaScript but works in React. And this is how all these list items are in the end added to this unordered list here. Now this active content index thing is kind of like a variable. It's created and controlled with a React feature called useState. And this in the end creates a dynamic React managed variable, you could say, that can be updated with help of this setActiveContentIndex function here, which for example gets used for these click listeners, which are also directly added to the buttons right inside that HTML code here. And then it's this ActiveContentIndex variable that changes and influences how the current UI looks like. Because React basically watches this variable, and whenever it does change, it takes a look at your HTML code here, checks all these conditions and executes all that code, and sees if that code now should lead to a different UI than what was rendered before. And if a different UI is needed, React goes ahead and updates the UI. It does all these things automatically for you. Because when working with React, you in the end write declarative code, which means you define the target UI state or states, not the steps needed to get there, and React will figure out how to get there and perform the necessary steps. So when writing React code, you're writing code in a declarative way. And that's a key thing to understand and keep in mind, because that's how React works in the end. On the other hand, when writing vanilla JavaScript code, you're writing imperative code, not declarative code, which simply means you're not defining the goal, but instead the steps needed to get there. And as you can see in this example, that's of course way more cumbersome and difficult. Because even though this here is a very basic and simple example, we do have to find a lot of steps to get the desired behavior. And it's easy to forget a step or introduce some error along the way. Updating this code and handling a fourth button also could become unnecessarily complex. So here we got these step-by-step instructions and therefore this imperative approach. In React instead, it's all pretty lean, it's less code that needs to be written, and React takes care of updating the UI. React uses JavaScript under the hood to update the UI, and we instead just define our conditions, our target states, and when these states should change, and React will take care of the rest.